Maya Chen stood outside the grand concert hall, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her worn leather bag. The building towered above her like a palace made of glass and marble, its golden light spilling onto the street below. She had traveled 3 days by bus to reach this city, spending nearly all her savings on the journey. Her clothes were simple and clean but clearly second-hand, and her shoes had been resoled twice. As she stepped through the massive doors, the warmth of the lobby wrapped around her like an embrace. Crystal chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings, and well-dressed people moved through the space with an air of confidence that made her feel small. Maya had grown up in a tiny village nestled in the mountains, where electricity arrived only 10 years ago, and running water was still a luxury some families didn't have. Her father worked in the local mine, his hands permanently stained black from coal dust. Her mother sold vegetables at the market every morning before dawn. They had sacrificed everything to buy her a second-hand keyboard when she was 7 years old. After her school teacher noticed her tapping out melodies on her desk during math lessons, that keyboard had missing keys and a broken sustain pedal. But to Maya, it was the most precious thing in the world. She taught herself to play by watching free videos on the community center's single computer, staying long after everyone else had gone home. Her fingers would move over the keys for hours, practicing scales and simple songs until the caretaker gently reminded her it was time to lock up. By the time she was 15, she could play pieces that made the villagers gather around her during festivals, their eyes wide with wonder. But Maya knew the difference between impressing villagers and being a real pianist. She had heard recordings of the masters, seen videos of concert halls like this one, and understood how far she still had to climb. The competition today was her chance to prove herself, to show that talent could bloom even in the poorest soil. She had sent in a recording made on her phone, propped up on a stack of books in her bedroom. The audio quality was terrible, with the sound of chickens clucking in the background and her neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls. But someone on the selection committee must have heard something worth nurturing, because 3 months later an envelope arrived with her acceptance letter. Her mother had cried when she read it, pressing the paper to her chest like it was made of gold. Now, standing in the registration line behind people in designer dresses and tailored suits, Maya felt the weight of her dream pressing down on her shoulders. The woman in front of her wore diamonds that caught the light with every movement, and the man behind her was discussing his recent performance at Carnegie Hall with someone on his phone. Maya's stomach churned with nervousness, but she kept her chin up. She had come too far to let fear turn her around now. When she reached the registration desk, the volunteer barely glanced at her as she handed over her confirmation number and received a badge with the number 47 printed on it. The waiting room was already crowded with other competitors, most of them younger than Maya's 22 years. They sat in clusters, some practicing finger exercises in the air, others reviewing sheet music with intense concentration. Maya found a corner seat and tried to steady her breathing. She closed her eyes and imagined her mother's face, the way it lit up when Maya played at home. She thought of her father, who had never said much but always stopped whatever he was doing to listen when she practiced. She remembered her little brother asking if she would be famous someday, his eyes full of innocent faith. A hush fell over the room as a tall man in an expensive black suit entered. His silver hair was perfectly styled and his presence commanded immediate attention. This was Victor Constantine, the legendary pianist whose recordings Maya had listened to 1,000 times, whose technique was studied in conservatories around the world. He was the head judge for this competition, and his opinion could make or break a career. Victor's eyes swept across the room with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen countless hopefuls come and go. When his gaze landed on Maya in her corner, something flickered across his face. It might have been curiosity or it might have been dismissal. Maya couldn't tell, but she felt her heart sink a little either way. The first competitor was called, and the room fell silent except for the distant sound of a piano beginning to play from the auditorium. Maya tried to calm her racing thoughts by reviewing the piece she had chosen mentally, her fingers moving slightly against her thighs. She had selected Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a piece that was perhaps too ambitious for someone of her training, but it was the song that had made her fall in love with piano in the first place. She had heard it played by a street musician in the city during her only previous visit, and something about its passionate, stormy beauty had spoken to her soul. As the morning wore on, competitors came and went. Some returned looking triumphant, others with tears streaming down their faces. Maya watched them all, trying to learn what she could from their expressions, their body language, their whispered conversations with friends and teachers. She noticed that most of them had people waiting for them, coaches who gave last-minute advice, parents who offered encouraging hugs. Maya was alone, and the isolation made her feel even more out of place in this world of privilege and preparation. When the lunch break was announced, Maya didn't move from her seat. She had packed 2 rice balls and a bottle of water in her bag. Not enough to feel truly full, but all she could afford after paying for her bus ticket and the cheapest hostel she could find. Around her, other competitors left in groups to find restaurants, discussing where had the best pasta or which cafe served the finest coffee. Their casual talk about spending money on a single meal what Maya's family earned in a week made her acutely aware of the vast distance between their worlds. She was nibbling on her second rice ball when Victor, Constantine, entered the waiting room again, this time accompanied by 2 other judges. They were doing a walkthrough, observing the competitors in their unguarded moments. Maya kept her eyes down, hoping to avoid attention, but she heard their footsteps stop near her corner. Through her lowered lashes, she could see Victor's polished shoes just inches from where she sat. His voice when he spoke was loud enough for several people nearby to hear clearly. "Tell me, where do they find these competitors nowadays?" Victor said to his colleague, his tone dripping with disdain. "Look at this one, eating rice balls like she's at a picnic. Does she think this is a community talent show?" His companion chuckled, a sound that made Maya's cheeks burn with humiliation. She kept her head down, her hands frozen around her simple meal. Victor continued, apparently unconcerned about being overheard, or perhaps intending to be heard. "I can always spot the ones who don't belong. Wrong clothes, wrong posture, wrong everything. They waste everyone's time, including their own. This competition is for serious musicians, not village girls playing dress-up." The words hit Maya like physical blows, each one landing with cruel precision. She felt the eyes of other competitors on her, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the drama unfolding. A few even nodded in agreement with Victor's assessment, as if he had simply voiced what they were all thinking. Maya's throat tightened and she fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She would not prove him right by breaking down like a child. Victor and his companions moved on, their laughter fading as they left the room. But the damage was done. Maya sat frozen in her corner, the half-eaten rice ball now impossible to swallow past the lump in her throat. Around her, whispers started spreading like wildfire. Who was that girl? Where did she come from? Did you see her clothes? Maybe Victor was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. The words swirled around her, each whisper another small cut. For a long moment, Maya considered standing up and walking out. She could catch a bus tonight, be home by Monday, tell her parents that she had tried but the competition was too fierce. They would understand. They would never blame her for failing. But as she sat there, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life, something began to shift inside her chest. It started as a tiny spark of anger, hot and bright. Who was Victor Constantine to decide where she belonged? Who was he to judge her worth based on her clothes and her background? Maya thought of her father, descending into the dark mine every morning, risking his life so she could have opportunities he never had. She thought of her mother, whose hands were rough from years of work but could still be gentle when she braided Maya's hair. She thought of her brother, who believed his sister could do anything. She thought of all the hours she had practiced in the cold, her fingers stiff and aching because she didn't have money for heating in winter. She thought of every sacrifice, every dream deferred, every moment of doubt she had overcome to get to this point. The spark of anger grew into a flame, and with it came a clarity that cut through her humiliation. She would not let Victor Constantine send her home in shame. She would not let his cruelty define her worth. She would walk onto that stage and play with everything she had, and she would make him eat every word of his mockery. Maya carefully wrapped up the rest of her rice ball and put it back in her bag. She stood up, smoothed down her simple dress, and lifted her chin. Her hands had stopped trembling. Her breath came steady and sure. When her number was called, she would be ready. The afternoon session began with renewed energy, and Maya watched as competitor after competitor took their turn on stage. Through the waiting room speakers, she could hear fragments of their performances. Some were technically flawless, their fingers flying across the keys with machine-like precision. Others had a warmth to their playing that spoke of genuine feeling, even if their technique wasn't perfect. Maya listened to them all, absorbing what she could, letting their music fuel her own preparation. She was lost in her mental rehearsal when a young woman sat down beside her. The girl was probably 18 or 19 with kind eyes and a nervous smile. "Don't let him get to you," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Victor Constantine is brilliant, but he's also cruel. He did the same thing to my older sister 3 years ago. Called her an amateur in front of everyone. She ended up placing second in the competition and now studies at Juilliard. He was wrong about her, and he's wrong about you too." The unexpected kindness made Maya's eyes sting with gratitude. She managed a small smile in return. "Thank you," she whispered back. "That means more than you know." The girl squeezed her hand briefly before standing up. "Go show him what real music sounds like," she said, then returned to her own seat across the room. Maya felt something loosen in her chest, a tiny bit of the shame and isolation falling away. She wasn't completely alone after all. As the numbers climbed higher, Maya's turn drew closer. She could feel her heart beginning to race again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was anticipation, determination, even excitement. She stood and made her way toward the stage entrance, where a volunteer was coordinating the flow of competitors. The woman gave her an encouraging nod. "You're up after the next one," she said. "There's a practice room down the hall if you want to warm up your fingers." Maya found the small practice room and sat at the upright piano inside. It wasn't the beautiful grand piano that waited on stage, but it was enough. She began with simple scales, letting her fingers remember the familiar patterns, feeling the keys beneath her touch. Then she played through a few passages from her chosen piece, the notes flowing from memory into her muscles. She didn't try to play the entire thing. She wanted to save that for the stage, where it would matter most. When the volunteer appeared at the door to signal her turn, Maya felt strangely calm. She followed the woman down a corridor that seemed to stretch forever, the sound of applause echoing from somewhere ahead. They reached the wings of the stage, and Maya could see the massive concert hall spreading out before her. Hundreds of seats rose in elegant tiers, and every one of them was filled. Stage lights created pools of brightness on the polished floor, and in the center of it all sat the piano, a magnificent black grand that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The previous competitor finished his piece and took his bow to polite applause. As he walked off stage, passing Maya in the wings, he looked pale and shaken. She overheard him muttering to his teacher about missing several difficult passages. Maya took a deep breath. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall, clear and professional. "Next, we have competitor number 47, Maya Chen, performing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor." Maya walked onto the stage, her simple dress and worn shoes suddenly feeling less important. The piano was waiting for her, patient and promising. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her as she crossed the vast space, but she kept her focus on her destination. When she reached the piano bench, she allowed herself one glance at the judges' table in the front row. Victor Constantine sat in the center, his expression already bored, as if he had already decided she wasn't worth his attention. The other judges looked more neutral, their faces professionally blank. Maya sat down and adjusted the bench slightly, a movement she had practiced 1,000 times at home. She let her hands rest on the keys for a moment, feeling their cool smoothness, letting the weight of the piano's potential sink into her bones. The hall was so quiet she could hear someone cough in the back row. She closed her eyes briefly, and in that moment of darkness she made a choice. She would not play for Victor Constantine. She would not play to prove him wrong or to answer his mockery. She would play for herself, for her parents, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. She would play because music was the truest thing she knew, and no one could take that away from her. Maya opened her eyes, placed her fingers on the starting notes, and began to play. The opening of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 emerged from the piano like a whisper, tentative and questioning, the melody unfurling with delicate beauty. Her fingers found the keys with absolute certainty, and as the music began to build, Maya felt herself falling into that special state where nothing existed except the piano and the song flowing through her. The music started softly, almost fragile, like the first light of dawn breaking over mountains. Maya's fingers moved across the keys with a tenderness that made the opening phrases shimmer with vulnerability. She had played this piece hundreds of times on her broken keyboard at home, but this was different. This piano responded to her touch like a living thing, Every nuance and shading she had imagined suddenly possible. The notes sang out into the vast hall, filling the space with Chopin's bittersweet beauty. As the piece progressed, Maya felt the music taking hold of her completely. The first major theme emerged, and her playing grew more confident, more passionate. Her hands swept across the keyboard with increasing urgency, drawing out the tumultuous emotions buried in Chopin's composition. She forgot about the audience, forgot about the judges, forgot about everything except the conversation she was having with the composer across more than a century of time. This was what music meant to her, this connection to something larger than herself, this ability to touch the infinite through 88 keys. In the third row, an elderly woman who had attended countless concerts over her lifetime found tears streaming down her face. She couldn't remember the last time a performance had moved her so deeply. Beside her, her husband reached over and squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening. Around the hall, people who had been politely attentive to previous performers now sat forward in their seats, drawn in by something they couldn't quite name, but could definitely feel. This wasn't just technically proficient playing. This was music with a soul. The piece built toward its first climax, and Maya's entire body moved with the music. Her shoulders swayed, her head tilted back slightly, and her fingers attacked the keys with a fierce joy. The piano roared with the storm of emotions Chopin had poured into this ballade. Rage and sorrow and defiance all tangled together in cascading runs and thunderous chords. Maya channeled every ounce of hurt from Victor's mockery, every moment of doubt she had ever felt, every time someone had made her feel small and worthless. It all poured out through her fingers, transformed into something beautiful and terrible and utterly honest. At the judges' table, Victor Constantine's bored expression had vanished. He sat rigid in his chair, his eyes locked on the young woman at the piano. His mouth had fallen slightly open, and one hand gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. He recognized what he was hearing, the unmistakable mark of genuine artistry. This wasn't the playing of an amateur or a village girl dabbling in music beyond her understanding. This was the playing of someone who truly understood Chopin's heart, who could bring his passion and pain to life in a way that transcended technical perfection. The other judges were equally transfixed. The woman to Victor's left, a renowned piano teacher from Paris, had abandoned her scoring sheet entirely. She simply listened, her professional detachment crumbling in the face of Maya's raw emotional honesty. The judge on Victor's right, a concert pianist who had performed on every major stage in the world, found himself comparing Maya's interpretation to the great recordings he had studied throughout his career. To his shock, she was holding her own against those legends, bringing fresh insight to a piece he had heard performed hundreds of times. Maya moved into the lyrical middle section of the ballade, and her playing softened like rain after a storm. Her touch became impossibly delicate, each note placed with the care of someone arranging flowers. This was the part that had always reminded her of her mother's lullabies, sung in their tiny house while wind howled down from the mountains. She played it with all the tenderness she felt for those memories, for the love that had sustained her through years of practice and sacrifice. The melody floated through the concert hall like a question without an answer, beautiful and heartbreaking. People in the audience found themselves holding their breath, afraid to break the spell. A teenage boy who had been forced to attend by his parents realized he was experiencing something he would remember for the rest of his life. A music critic who had written thousands of reviews over her career knew she was witnessing the birth of something special. An old piano professor recognized the playing of someone who hadn't just learned the notes but had lived them, who understood music not as an academic exercise but as a language of the soul. The piece moved toward its final section, and Maya's playing grew urgent again. The music spiraled upward in increasingly complex patterns, Chopin's genius demanding everything from the performer. Maya gave it everything she had. Her fingers flew across the keys in passages that would have challenged pianists with decades more training. But she didn't falter. She had practiced these sections until her hands ached and her back screamed in protest, sitting at her keyboard in a cold room while her family slept, driven by a hunger to master this music that she couldn't fully explain even to herself. The technical demands of the piece became ferocious, but Maya met them with a confidence that came from somewhere deeper than mere practice. Her hands crossed and recrossed, her fingers stretching to reach intervals that tested the limits of her reach, her whole body engaged in the physical act of making this music real. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she didn't notice. She was climbing toward the summit of the piece, toward the moment where everything Chopin had built would come crashing together in a final, devastating statement. The climax arrived like a wave breaking against cliffs. Maya's hands came down on the keys with tremendous force, drawing out massive chords that shook the air in the concert hall. The piano sang and roared, and for a moment it seemed impossible that so much sound could come from one instrument and one person. Every emotion she had suppressed, every hurt she had endured, every dream she had clung to despite impossible odds, all of it channeled into these final measures. The music was her voice, louder and clearer than she had ever been able to speak. Victor Constantine sat frozen at the judge's table, and something uncomfortable was happening in his chest. He felt ashamed, a sensation so unfamiliar that it took him a moment to recognize it. He had built a career on his ability to identify talent, to separate the pretenders from the genuine artists. He had prided himself on his exacting standards, on his refusal to waste time on those who didn't measure up. But he had been catastrophically wrong about this girl. He had judged her based on her clothes and her background, had dismissed her before she played a single note, and now he was being confronted with undeniable proof of his prejudice. The other competitors in the waiting room watched the performance on monitors, and many of them felt their own confidence draining away. They had played well, some of them brilliantly, but this was something different. This was the kind of performance that reminded everyone why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. The kind that made you remember that all the technique and training was meant to serve something larger and more mysterious than perfection. A few of them felt jealous, but most felt something closer to awe. Maya reached the final page of the piece where Chopin's ballade rushed toward its conclusion like a river reaching the sea. The music became both tender and fierce, resolving the tensions that had built throughout the piece into a bittersweet ending that acknowledged both loss and hope. Maya's playing captured every shade of that complexity, her fingers finding colors in the piano that seemed to glow with inner light. She played the last notes with a gentleness that made them sound like a prayer, like a blessing, like a goodbye to someone deeply loved. The final chord hung in the air, resonating through the hall's perfect acoustics. Maya's hands remained on the keys for a moment, her head bowed, her breathing deep and uneven from the physical and emotional exertion. The silence that followed was absolute. 2 seconds passed, then 3, then 4. Maya lifted her hands from the keys and sat back slightly, still lost in the world the music had created. She had given everything she had, held nothing back, and now she felt emptied out and strangely peaceful. Then the audience erupted. The sound started somewhere in the back rows and rolled forward like thunder, people leaping to their feet, applause crashing through the hall like waves. People were shouting "Brava" and whistling, and the thunderous ovation seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The elderly woman in the third row was openly weeping, and she wasn't alone. All around the hall, people stood and clapped with a fervor reserved for performances that transcend mere skill and touch something profound in the human heart. Maya slowly stood and turned to face the audience, still somewhat dazed. The sight of hundreds of people on their feet, applauding her, was so far beyond anything she had imagined that it didn't seem quite real. She managed a small bow, her movements uncertain, and the applause grew even louder. People were wiping tears from their eyes, embracing the strangers beside them, caught up in the collective experience of having witnessed something extraordinary. The ovation went on, minute after minute, showing no signs of fading. At the judges' table, Victor Constantine stood with the others, his hands coming together in mechanical applause. His face was pale and his expression was difficult to read, a mixture of emotions too complex to sort out in that moment. The judge beside him was clapping with uninhibited enthusiasm, tears streaming down her face without shame. She leaned toward Victor and had to shout to be heard over the roar of the crowd. "That," she said, "is why we do this. That is what we're always hoping to find." Maya bowed again, deeper this time, and allowed herself a small smile. She could see people in the front rows clearly now, could see their faces transformed by joy and emotion. For the first time since arriving at the concert hall, she didn't feel out of place. She didn't feel like a village girl playing dress-up. She felt like a musician, standing on a stage where she belonged, having spoken in the only language that truly mattered. The applause continued to wash over her, a tide of acceptance and recognition that healed wounds she hadn't known how to name. Maya finally walked off the stage, her legs trembling slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. As she stepped into the wings, the volunteer who had guided her to the stage earlier grabbed her hands, her eyes wide with excitement. "That was incredible," she whispered urgently. "I've worked at this competition for 5 years, and I've never heard anything like that. Never." Other backstage crew members nodded in agreement, their professional composure cracked by genuine emotion. One of them handed Maya a bottle of water with shaking hands, as if she had become someone important in the span of a single performance. The walk back to the waiting room felt surreal. Maya could still hear the applause fading behind her, still feel the echo of the music in her bones. Her hands ached in a satisfying way, the kind of ache that came from having used them fully and well. As she pushed open the door to the waiting room, conversation stopped abruptly. Every head turned to look at her. For a moment, Maya tensed, expecting judgment or resentment, but what she saw in their faces was something entirely different. Respect, admiration, even wonder. The young woman who had spoken kindly to her earlier rushed over and threw her arms around Maya in an impulsive hug. "You were amazing," she said, pulling back with a huge grin. "Absolutely amazing. My hands are still shaking from listening to you." Other competitors came forward, offering congratulations, asking where she had studied, wanting to know her story. A few of the ones who had nodded in agreement with Victor's earlier mockery now couldn't meet her eyes, their faces red with shame at their own complicity in his cruelty. Maya answered their questions as best she could, still somewhat dazed by the sudden reversal of her social position in the room. She told them about her village, about teaching herself from videos, about her broken keyboard and years of solitary practice. They listened with expressions ranging from disbelief to inspiration, and several of them admitted they had never worked as hard as she must have to reach this level. A boy of about 16 with perfectly styled hair and an expensive watch said quietly, "I've had the best teachers money can buy since I was 4 years old, and I couldn't play like that. You made me remember why I wanted to learn piano in the first place." The competition continued through the afternoon, but Maya knew that something fundamental had shifted. Competitors who performed after her seemed shaken, their confidence undermined by the impossibly high bar she had set. Some of them played beautifully anyway, finding their own voices and truths in their chosen pieces. Others fell apart under the pressure, their fingers fumbling passages they had played perfectly in practice. Maya watched and listened when she could, but mostly she sat quietly in her corner, processing what had just happened, letting her racing heart gradually slow to normal. As evening approached, all the competitors were called back into the auditorium for the announcement of results. Maya filed in with the others, finding a seat in the middle section. The vast hall that had been full of audience members earlier was now occupied only by competitors, judges, and competition officials. Stage lights had been dimmed to a softer glow, and a podium had been set up at center stage. The head of the competition, a distinguished older man with silver spectacles, stood to address them. He spoke about the high level of talent they had witnessed today, about the difficulty of judging when so many performers had displayed remarkable skill and musicality. He thanked the sponsors and the judges for their service. Maya listened with half her attention, her mind already beginning to drift toward practical concerns. When would the last bus leave? Did she have enough money for dinner before the journey home? Would her hostel room still be available if she needed to stay one more night? Then Victor Constantine rose and approached the podium. The room fell silent, every eye on the legendary pianist. He stood for a moment without speaking, and Maya noticed that he looked older somehow, more uncertain than he had appeared that morning. When he finally spoke, his famous voice carried clearly through the hall, but it lacked its earlier arrogance. "I have been a pianist and a judge for 40 years, he began. "I have heard thousands of performers on stages around the world. I have prided myself on my ability to recognize true talent, to separate technique from artistry, to know genius when I hear it." He paused, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "Today I was reminded that pride can make us blind, that our assumptions and prejudices can cause us to miss the extraordinary when it stands right in front of us." A murmur rippled through the audience of competitors. People began to glance toward Maya, and she felt her cheeks growing warm. Victor continued, "This morning I said cruel and unjustifiable things about a young woman whose only crime was being born into circumstances beyond her control. I judged her without hearing her play. I dismissed her talent before she had a chance to show it." Victor's eyes swept the room and found Maya sitting in the middle section. He looked directly at her as he spoke. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. And I apologize not just to her but to all of you, because my behavior was unworthy of someone in my position. Music doesn't care about your clothes or your connections or how much money your parents have. Music only cares about truth and beauty and the courage to be vulnerable. And today Maya Chen showed us all what that really means. His voice cracked slightly on her name, and Maya saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. The room erupted in applause, and this time it was specifically for her, for Victor's public acknowledgement of his mistake and her triumph. Maya sat frozen in her seat, overwhelmed by the weight of this moment. She had wanted to prove Victor wrong, had wanted to show him that he couldn't judge her worth by her appearance. But she hadn't expected this public confession, this vulnerability from a man known for his harsh perfectionism. Around her, other competitors were standing, turning toward her with applause, and she slowly rose to her feet, not quite sure what else to do. Victor waited for the applause to die down before continuing. The judges were unanimous in our decision, which almost never happens. Usually we argue for hours, debating the merits of different performances. Today there was no debate. He picked up an envelope from the podium and opened it with steady hands. First place in this year's competition goes to Maya Chen for a performance of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 that reminded us all why we fell in love with music in the first place. More applause, louder this time, and Maya felt her knees go weak. First place. She had won. The prize included a cash award that would be more money than her family earned in 2 years, plus a scholarship to study at one of the finest music conservatories in Europe. It meant she could help her parents, support her brother's education, and continue her own training under masters who could help her refine her raw talent into something even more remarkable. It meant everything had changed in the space of one afternoon. Competition officials gestured for her to come to the stage, and Maya walked down the aisle on legs that didn't quite feel like her own. The other competitors applauded as she passed, and many of them reached out to touch her arm or shoulder in congratulation. She climbed the stairs to the stage, and Victor Constantine stepped forward to meet her. For a moment they stood facing each other, the famous pianist and the village girl he had mocked, and the entire hall held its breath to see what would happen next. Victor extended his hand, and Maya took it. His grip was firm, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. I am deeply sorry for what I said earlier. It was cruel and unforgivable. You are a remarkable musician, and you have taught me a lesson in humility that I clearly needed to learn. His eyes were earnest, pleading for understanding, and Maya saw in them genuine regret. She squeezed his hand and replied just as quietly, Thank you for your apology, and thank you for giving me the chance to prove myself, even if you didn't know that's what you were doing. Something like relief crossed Victor's face, and he placed his other hand over their joined hands, a gesture of respect and perhaps absolution. Then he stepped back and raised his voice so the whole hall could hear. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you this year's winner and a pianist we will all be hearing much more from in the years to come. Maya Chen. He began to applaud, and everyone else joined in, and Maya stood at the center of the stage feeling like she might burst from the enormity of everything she was feeling. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of photographs and interviews and handshakes with people whose names Maya immediately forgot. The other judges each took time to speak with her, offering advice and encouragement, telling her about teachers they knew who would be perfect for someone of her talent. Fellow competitors came to congratulate her, and Maya exchanged contact information with several of them, making friendships that would last throughout her career. Someone gave her a bouquet of roses, and she clutched them like a lifeline, their fragrance sweet and almost overwhelming. As the celebration finally began to wind down, Maya found a quiet corner and pulled out her phone with shaking hands. It was late, nearly midnight, but she knew her parents would be awake, anxiously waiting for news. Her father answered on the first ring, his voice rough with worry and hope. Maya, how did it go? She could hear her mother and brother crowding close, trying to hear. Papa, she said, and her voice broke on the word. Papa, I won. I won first place. The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a sob and a shout of joy. She heard her mother crying, heard her brother yelling with excitement, heard her father trying to speak through tears he had probably never shed in front of anyone before. They all talked over each other, asking questions, expressing disbelief and pride, and Maya sat in her quiet corner and let their love wash over her through the phone. "I'm coming home soon," she told them, "and I'm bringing enough money to fix the roof and get Baba a new pair of boots and pay for Jian's school fees next year. And then I'm going to Europe to study, but I'll come home to visit as often as I can." Before she left the concert hall, Maya went back to the stage one last time. The lights were mostly off now and the vast space was empty and quiet. She walked to the piano and ran her hand along its polished surface, saying a silent thank you to the instrument that had carried her voice to the world. She thought about all the practice sessions on her broken keyboard, all the times she had doubted herself, all the obstacles she had overcome to stand on this stage. She thought about Victor's cruelty and his redemption, about the power of music to transform both performer and listener, about the strange and beautiful journey that had brought her from a tiny mountain village to this moment. Maya Chen left the concert hall as the sun was rising over the city, her prize certificate in her bag, her heart full of gratitude and hope. She had silenced a crowd with her music, yes, but more importantly, she had proven to herself that she belonged wherever her talent and hard work could take her. The girl who had arrived yesterday, trembling and uncertain, was gone. In her place stood a pianist who knew her own worth, who had faced cruelty and responded with beauty, who had turned mockery into triumph through nothing more than truth and courage and 88 keys. Her real journey was just beginning, but she would face it the way she had faced everything else in her life, with determination, with grace, and with music flowing from her fingers like light.